Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'm going to take a little bit of a step away from the usual material and instead cover and discuss five classic novels. There are four English language and one French language novel that's been translated into the English. I guess white history and the white society, white culture, it's under such an attack these days that I wonder whether students or the populace generally will get to hear about these classic novels in the years to come. Maybe not. Either they'll be vanquished completely, or they'll be rewritten so that David Copperfield is a black lesbian and so will be the main characters of the Charles Dickens novels and everything else. They'll all be black lesbians or transgender this or so and so, and the essence of the story, of course, will be lost, or they'll be rewritten to make white people look bad. So it's probably for posterity. Maybe I'm thinking about looking at these novels. The Western culture and tradition has got some great literature and some great works, and we should celebrate them. And the art of reading, I think, has been lost. How long since you read a book cover to cover? Even now, in most bookstores or online, you download a synopsis of a book, which many students use close to word for word, and that seems to be accepted by academics. And similarly, facts no longer seem to matter, or accuracy. So as long as you're saying bad things about white people, or bad things particularly about straight white males, most college papers get a pass for doing just that. So anyway, let's look at these books. Now, I've picked some books that these are ones that I like, and for just looking at it, I always found Charles Dickens hard work. So I had trouble I don't doubt that in its way it's classic literature, and there are certain passages or maybe a few pages here and there, but generally I don't particularly like the works of Dickens, but many others do, and so that's fine. But other things like Dostoevsky, I understand the psychological complexity of his novels, but it's not an easy read. And say Tolstoy, War and Peace, I mean, that's a tour de force, no question, but it's actually hard work getting through. So part of, I think, enjoying reading or enjoying a novel or enjoying any written material is that you enjoy reading it. So as well as being great literature, you do get enjoyment from it. Now, there's other books that I realise are great literature, but I don't particularly like them. So anyway, Somerset Maugham, he was a writer he was initially a playwright, actually, and did very well at it in the 1890s, early 1900s. And then he turned to writing novels, and one of his earlier novels, I think it was around 1919, was called The Moon and Sixpence. Now, he was a British novelist and very, very much a product of that late Victorian Edwardian period in England, but his writing and the way he structures sentences and the clarity of his prose, and some of his pages, it's not a wasted word, and it's a pleasure to read, and you can read it again and enjoy it just as much as the first time. Well, that's my experience. The Moon and Sixpence is and I'll give you a brief synopsis here, is about a London stockbroker who decides that he wants to become a painter. So he abandons everything, family, home, the whole business, and goes from London to Paris, which was considered at that time the place for moral revolution. And in fact, the people from the early 1900s that were the artists and so on, and the singers, they called themselves the children of the revolution. But really, it was very loosely based on the life of French painter Paul Gauguin, who similarly sort of threw it all in to become a painter, and he really defined a new style of art in the way it was presented, and the combination of colours he used, and the type of lighting that was in his. And it could be just a bowl of fruit or something like that. Gauguin later went to Tahiti, where he sort of went native, but he continued painting, and he died there, as I understand it, of syphilis some years later. So Maugham created an English character to portray this loose relationship to Paul Gauguin, the artist, and so this guy goes to Paris, and then effectively a Somerset Maugham character. So the writer, speaking of himself in the first person, goes to Paris to try and convince this guy to come back to England, but to no avail. And then it covers the life of this character in Paris and his interactions with Somerset Maugham's character throughout the novel. I quite like. There's a couple of slow spots in it, but otherwise it's I think one of the great novels. It's not long; it's a fairly short story. One of the great novels in my view, certainly of that period, and in my view of all time. So Somerset Maugham also wrote other novels, tending to the melancholy in all of them, but novels such as The Razor's Edge and there's a few others that I hoped to bring to mind just then, but didn't. I enjoy his writings. He also wrote a collection of short stories, some of which were turned into movies. One of them was called Rain, and he particularly liked dealing with the human failing and its ability and its attempts of the human character and its flaws to come to terms with the realities of life around them and so on. But he certainly did tend to the melancholy. He had quite a bad stammer when he was a child and was given, as you can imagine, at school, a hard time from it, and the scars of that seemed to continue on throughout his life. He got married early, and at the time he was a successful playwright, but he decided he was homosexual, and then led a life that reflected those pursuits. He moved to France, just on the Mediterranean, a place called Cape Ferrat in the south of France, and I read a biography of him, and I hadn't. The things I would rather not have known, because I admired him so much from a literary perspective. But his private pursuits and the sort of parties and the general getting young boys from North Africa and bringing them over for him and his buddies, that sort of rather put me off and soured what I thought was really a great writer and someone of huge literary standing. He lived to be quite old. I think he was born in 1880 or something like that, and ended up dying in the 1960s. So he lived a long life. So that's Somerset Maugham, The Moon and Sixpence. You can probably pick it up at a second-hand bookshop for a couple of bucks. So worth looking at there. The next one I had on the list was Madame Bovary. Now, this was written by a French writer called Flaubert, and there was something of a renaissance, I guess, in French sort of writing. And going really borrowing from the likes of the Rousseaus and so on, and their sort of view of, again, the human condition, this relationship to things like the state and law and so on. So and natural laws and laws imposed by man. So Flaubert did a story about. And this is mid 1800s. He did a story about a somewhat successful sort of businessman and his wife, and the relationship with his wife and his wife's expectations on her entitlements and the way he attempted to cater for that, which ended up being the basis for the destruction of both of them. Now, the interesting thing about Flaubert was he was talking, probably one of the first writers or novelists to talk about modern marriage in the sense of the industrial age, where surplus wealth was far more possible than it ever had been previously, and the increasing role of the state in running the economy and so on. And there's some interesting thing. Flaubert brings a sense of reality. And when you read through it, it really has a sense of reality about it, as if he's talking about real people and real situations, which I guess is the essence of great writing. But you really can identify with some of the characters and some of the goings on and imagine yourself there, as Flaubert writes about. There's one scene where the protagonists are having a chat, but there's also some government minister or something nearby who's making a speech about the government's policies in regard to agriculture and so on, farming and the like. And Flaubert cuts in between the conversations of the protagonists and then the speech of the government minister, and he blends that into the story. So again, that you at least I did, you really feel you're there. Now I thought Madame Bovary, in terms of that ability to create a reality that you feel part of, I thought is one of the great novels of the last 100 years because of that. And so it's worth a little bit on the melancholy side, as a lot of these novelists tend to be, but it's certainly if you're looking at classic literature and just the way it's laid out and how it involves the reader, I think it's one of the great reads and strongly recommended to you. There's another writer. He's a British writer or English Scottish writer, Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, he was around in the 1800s. Man of ill health, but he wrote a number of novels. Some you've probably heard of. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was among his most famous, but he also wrote other novels, Treasure Island and Kidnapped, and some more besides. Now, I'll use Treasure Island to kick off with. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, again, is probably the one you know the most, but Treasure Island's about, it's sort of set in the 1700s in southern England at a village called Penzance, and which is sort of on the southwestern tip of England in the county of Cornwall. And there's a place there, like a pub or an inn, as they would have called it at the time, a public house where people can go and drink ale and the like, called the Admiral Benbow, who was a British admiral of historical sort of importance. Now that inn still exists today. So if you go to Penzance in Cornwall, you can actually walk down some of the streets and go to some of the places that Robert Louis Stevenson, the novelist, was talking about in his book Treasure Island. That kind of adds, I think, an element of reality, if not excitement, to it all. Now, Cornwall was a bit of a hangout for pirates and so on of the day. The government at the time didn't quite have full control of the area, so the pirates and the smugglers used to hang out there, and they had special little escape routes down through caves and caverns to get to their rowboats, so they could get out to their ship and make a getaway before the redcoats got them, that sort of thing. So, but Treasure Island is a thing about buried treasure on an island, and how this crew is going to get the treasure. And there's, as you can imagine, a lot of baddies in the crew, a lot of bad guys. The bad guy Long John Silver is one of the characters there that's a bad guy, and there's there always seems to be a young boy who's sort of the good, one of the goodies in the thing, and a squire or someone like that. I think it's Squire Trelawney off the top of my head is one of the good guys, and the good guys win in the end. But the novel manages to keep you in suspense. I think sort of more so than most novels keep you in suspense, but not using the same sort of hackneyed, cliched suspense type prose. Stevenson manages to make unique suspense experiences you go through the novel, and I think that makes him an unusual writer and a great writer. If you look at some of the big novelists today, some of the big names, dare I mention it, Robert Ludlum and so on, really he's got a formulaic way of writing, and he just inserts different characters into it, slightly changes the plot, and then but each book's roughly the same. If you read 3 of his books in a row, by the time you get to the 3rd book, you can almost tell what's going to happen on the next page. So it's so formulaic. Stevenson manages to make it, I think, a unique experience, as he does in his subsequent novels, such as Kidnapped. So on that basis, I see Stevenson and Treasure Island was a hugely successful novel. It still sells today. So I think that uniqueness of that suspenseful writing that Stevenson brings to his novels, and at the same time, a sort of innocence. There's on one side you have the innocence, on the other the sinister, and then the way he narrates it. And I think that's quite clever. So I'd rate that as a great novel. So Treasure Island from Robert Louis Stevenson. The next one I'd like to mention is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. You've probably heard about this. They've made a couple of movies about it. In fact, there might even have been 3. It's about a bunch of kids that get marooned on an island, and there's I don't know, 20 odd kids, however many there are, and they're all under, I think they're all from young teenagers and even younger than that. And it's how they organise a society on the island, and all its shortcomings, all its brutalities, and its coarseness and callousness and so on. It's a little bit sanitized, I guess, given the time it was written, but in, I think, the 1950s. But it's nonetheless, I think, a brilliant piece of writing about the human condition, and in this instance, children, and how they organised and dealt with their, in the absence of adults, dealt with and how their moral compass was in some cases at least reinvented, and how expediency would override any moral considerations. Now, Lord of the Flies was a pig they managed to kill, and they put the head on a stake, and the flies sort of went round the rotting carcass, and that was the Lord of the Flies, and the rotting carcass of the pig. So, but it to me is one of the it sort of gave an aspect again of the human condition, as some of these other novels do. And it was, I think, very well put together and quite brilliantly portrayed. And it kept going at a certain pace, which really had you engrossed. So it still was a page turner, even though it was dealing with some issues that would have easily lent themselves to quite turgid prose. This moved along quite nicely. And again, I think that's I included that in there somewhat because it was a little bit of a different take on things. But so I'd recommend that, Lord of the Flies by William Golding. The last one, and one that, in fact, there's 2 more here actually, was great. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald wasn't a huge success when it came out in the 1920s. This was the roaring 1920s. The American economy was booming. Everyone looked like they were making money. Stock market was going hysterical, and so it's about a guy who was doing all sorts of bad things, rigging the stock market and engaged in large-scale pharmaceutical fraud and things like that. But he had a shitload of money, and he bought a mansion in a very upmarket part of New York, and his intention was to get back together with his childhood sweetheart that in the meantime had married into a rich family. And he used to throw these incredible parties and invite everybody. Nobody really knew him very well, but he was wanting to establish his credentials as a rich kick-ass dude, and hopefully win back his childhood sweetheart. So the interesting thing about Gatsby, or the novel, I think it's a great piece of writing. I think it's a must-read on anyone's list of classic and great literature, and I certainly enjoyed reading it. Again, a bit on the melancholy side. He's a bit of a spoiler alert here. He ends up getting killed by his childhood sweetheart's husband. That of all, not the husband. No, sorry, about the childhood sweetheart's husband has a lover, and she gets killed in a car accident, and the guy falsely believes that Gatsby was the driver, and so goes and shoots him. But he was set up by the husband. So that's Gatsby. But when it came to his funeral, nobody wanted to go, or there was hardly anybody would go except the sort of the main protagonist, Toby, who goes along. He even wanted others to go, but he couldn't get anyone to go. So all these freeloaders would come to his parties and all that sort of thing, but they wouldn't piss on him when he was dead or go to his funeral. That sort of personal experience. I knew a guy who, can't say I particularly liked him, but I knew a guy who was very wealthy in Australia, in Sydney, and people were queuing up to fillet him and all that sort of thing. Everybody wanted to be with him and be in his good graces. And a couple of things went wrong for him, and he suddenly found himself broke, and which was a huge come down because he's a very rich guy. And found himself broke, and then he died. Some suggest even by his own hand, but he died, and then his ex-wife called me, and my name was in some old address book or whatever he had, and she was in a bad way. So she was trying to get people to come to his funeral, and nobody wanted to come, and she was going through this book and just calling people that he'd known. No, I hadn't seen the guy for, I don't know, 15 years or so, but what a tragic end. And it reminded me, when I was reading Gatsby, it reminded me of this guy and his ex-wife desperately trying to find anyone who would come to his funeral. I thought that was quite sad, that given again how many people were crawling up his ass when he was alive and rich. But that's, I guess, how things are. But that was part of the Gatsby story as well. But the great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, thoroughly worth reading, and a great piece of literature. The last one is a British novel. I don't know if people outside of Britain would appreciate it as much, but it's by a great writer called Evelyn Waugh, who also wrote a novel called The Loved One, which maybe, I think it was made into a movie. I think Liberace may have actually played her on. This one's called Brideshead Revisited, and it's about a young university student who becomes chummy with one of the wealthiest families in England, and he knows one of the guys from the university, and he too comes from money, but not the same scale of money as, and so they go to this huge estate known as Brideshead in the novel, and the guy that he's met at, the main protagonist has met at the university, is in very distressed state and drinks himself to death, actually, in the end, and so the only friend he really has is this guy, the main protagonist, Charles Ryder. So then they go off and do their own thing. They head off in different directions. Then World War II comes along, and the Charles Ryder's detachment is billeted at this Brideshead castle. And so as he's walking around, he then reminisces about his youth and about his interactions with the family. And so he goes to Brideshead again. So that's the title, Brideshead Revisited. But it's a great look at university life at the time, the life of the well-to-do, and the class system in England at the time, and how that changed, and how life was changing generally, going from the 1920s after World War I through to the 1950s. And Evelyn Waugh, the novelist, I think captures that perfectly well, and it's again one of the great novels, and one that there's a series made of it. I think you can even see it on YouTube. Brideshead Revisited, the series, the TV series. Jeremy Irons and Anthony Andrews playing the lead role, along with some other big names, Claire Bloom and so on. So this is a great novel, and Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, and again, some beautiful prose, beautiful writing, beautifully structured sentences. And if you want to appreciate sort of classic literature, then this is something worth looking at. Well, I hope I've given you something to think about, and hoping you all curl up with a good book in the days to come. Thank you for listening.